that sounds your plan.
Stephen. Great. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Sam Goldstein, the Director of Legal Affairs for B'nai Brith Canada, and I'm also the National Director of the Data Thought Society. I want to thank all of you who are appearing in that Hollywood Zoom squares before me for attending, and I thank the people here who are in attendance at the Minden Gross Law Firm. We thank them for sponsoring this event, and board it as well. Many people know the Mayans Law Society is named after David Natus, who is a rights lawyer in Canada, still working at a society. Whereas B'nai Brith is one of the oldest, or the oldest human rights in Canada. We believe in the of equality, fighting for minority rights. And we believe that's the way rights is to. I'm here really pleased with David Bernstein. David L. Bernstein has served as senior roles in various American and his career serving the American Jewish community, director of the American Jewish Committee's Washington office, served as president and CEO of the Jewish Council of Public Affairs from 2016 to 2021. He is now the founder and CEO of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and the author of Woke Anti-Semitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. David, thank you for being here.
Great to be with you.
So, David, let me start off with my first question stemming from
Sam.
a forward.
Sam, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're having a really hard time hearing you. I don't know if you can speak directly into the mic.
It's in. Bring your mic closer to you.
Hello? There we go. Okay. Hear me better?
Close to your face.
Hear me better?
Not quite.
Hope so. Better?
You want to use my mic?
We'll put the mic in. Thank you for whomever that was. Okay, I hope you can hear me better. You're welcome. David, let me just read from the foreword, which was written by Nathan Sharansky. And he wrote, like many Jews from the former Soviet Union, both in the U.S. and in Israel, I am concerned about the ideological environment in the U.S., a global superpower, a beacon of hope for all of humanity, and the main defender of freedom and human rights in the world. I am concerned about the emergence of a dogma. Some call it woke ideology, not unlike the totalitizing ideology I grew up with in the Soviet Union, which has taken the American left by storm, and with it many American cultural institutions. So, David, tell us what you mean by woke ideology.
Yeah, thank you. That's always a good place to start because the term woke has become so explosive now in the discourse. You use the term woke and people immediately suspect that you're aligned with far-right institutions, and that wasn't, or political figures, and that wasn't always the case. So let me just tell you what I mean by woke and what I mean by it on the cover of my book. So we're very clear on the terms, and if we want to use a different term because it's just too hot to handle, then we'll use a different term. So what I mean by woke are two fundamental tenets. Number one, that bias and oppression and bigotry are not just a matter of one's personal attitudes, but they are ingrained in the very systems and structures of society. They're in the air that we breathe. That's number one sort of key tenet. The second key tenet of this ideology is that only people with lived experience of that oppression, only someone representing a marginalized group, has the standing and the insight, really, to be able to articulate it and define it for the rest of society. So a black person gets to define racism, a Muslim Islamophobia, a woman misogyny, a Jew anti-Semitism, maybe not so much. And so what happens sometimes is that insistence that only people who have experienced the oppression get to define it sort of weaponizes the first. So it says America or North America are pervasively racist societies, and if you question my view on that, then you are engaging in a kind of privilege or a kind of racism, really. And that's the root of this ideological problem. It's the root of cancel culture. It's what I mean by woke ideology. If we want to call it radical social justice ideology, or as some call it critical social justice ideology, I'm all in. But we do have to call it something.
A number of times in your book, and a number of commentators on the sort of woke ideology or progressivism or critical race theory, CRT, often make the point that it's an illiberal ideology. And so can you kind of, now liberalism, I know in your country sometimes has a bad name to it, but we're talking about sort of classical liberalism, the liberal principles, believing in free speech, merit, individual rights and so on. How is it an illiberal ideology, and why is that bad?
So great question. So liberal means different things, probably depending on where you live very often. At least it's associated with different political belief systems. So in the U.S., it usually means center-left. In the UK, by the way, it means basically center. I think in Australia, it means right. But what I mean by it is classical liberalism, the free expression of ideas, the rule of law. And that's not a point of view like my point of view on reproductive rights or whatever. It's the fundamental operating system of Western societies. It's what we mean by Enlightenment values. The ability of people to argue with each other, to disagree, to try to struggle with differences of opinion so that we can kind of come to the best approximation of the truth. That's what liberalism is as an operating system, and that's why I think it's so dangerous when it's undermined, because we really can't have thriving democratic life without fundamental and underlying liberal values at work. So illiberalism in this sense is being opposed or challenging that value system. And what I talked about as the second tenet of those two tenets about what is wokeism, I talked about one's standpoint as someone who's oppressed. That's sometimes called standpoint epistemology. I know that's a complicated term, but what's meant by it is that instead of you and I arguing about something that we disagree with and trying to come up with the best possible approximation, and maybe even agreeing to disagree, you say, no, I'm sorry, Sam, you have no right to your opinion. That's illiberal. That's what I mean by illiberal, that you have no right to your opinion because your opinion is based on your privilege. And I think that's fundamentally dangerous, and it's dangerous to our self-conception as Jews as well, and this is something I don't want to lose sight of. Judaism, central to who we are, is this idea of machloket l'shem shamayim, arguments for the sake of heaven. I mean, if you go back to the great sages, the houses of Hillel and Shammai, they disagreed vehemently on what the law should be. And the famous legend is that there was a long-term disagreement between the two houses on some point of law, and God ultimately sided with the house of Hillel. Why did God side with the house of Hillel? Because Hillel cited first Shammai's opinion before arguing their own. That's how far the Jewish tradition wants you to go in acknowledging alternative perspectives on matters of Jewish law. That is fundamental to who we are. The Talmudic tradition is layered arguments of rabbis over a course of hundreds of years. That's what it is. That's who we are. And to me, one of the saddest aspects of this is, in addition to the fact that I think it foments anti-Semitism, it also in some basic way undermines who we are as Jews and requires us to sign up for an ideology that violates our own fundamental precepts as a community.
So let's go to how you feel it's dangerous to the Jewish experience and how it's anti-Semitic. And to do that, you talk in your book about an important event that you had attended, where you started getting that sort of the Theodor Herzl moment, where there's something wrong going on within the political world you were living in and the Jewish world that you were living in. Can you talk about that moment? I know you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, there's a few, and I'll start with probably the early one, that probably what you're referring to. So here I'm a young professional staff person, in my late 20s, let's say, at the early 30s, I don't know, American Jewish Committee, and I was part of this leadership program where we had Multicultural Day. This is in 1999. This is 25 years ago. And I was excited for it. You know, I believed in multiculturalism. I'm Jewish. I'm diverse, right? I want to fit into a diverse, pluralistic American society. And the speaker gets up and he says, first, I'm going to define racism. Racism equals prejudice plus power. Prejudice plus power? What do you mean? I always thought racism was animus toward another racial group. That wasn't my understanding. And it hit me right then and there that if that definition really is becoming the dominant definition in progressive circles, that we have a big problem because Jews are perceived as being part of the dominant political class. So if we're perceived as having power, and if we're perceived as having power, we really can't be victims of racism. And if groups that are perceived as being powerless can't really be perpetrators, they can't really be victimizers. And I thought that really is problematic. And I wrote about it in the early 2000s in an op-ed. I said, if that becomes the dominant view on the left, I think we in the Jewish community are in trouble. And it wasn't the only time I wrote about it. I saw it developing in the discourse among the civil rights partners that we in the Jewish community usually dealt with, people who, you know, we'd always work with on issues that we cared about, that I still care about, issues that I care about, like criminal justice reform. I know we have a few criminal lawyers, and I know the situation might be different in Canada, but, you know, the U.S. incarcerates over 2 million people a year, many of whom are blacks, and on low-level drug charges. So there's a reason to fight against, in my view, that those policies. But the problem is that they started to establish ideological litmus tests around these ideas, that unless you believe that America is a quote-unquote white supremacist society, you really can't be part of this coalition. In other words, it was no longer just a common political aspiration and over a set of policies, but now it was an ideological litmus test. And I realized that that was really going to poison the well for the Jewish community. I wrote about it in the early 2000s. I wrote about it again in 2016, the first day on the job when I became the CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which is an umbrella organization of the various Jewish advocacy organizations from the United States. And I said, if this catches on, in those days I called it intersectionality, we are going to be facing an uphill battle. And I faced a horrible backlash. I think there was something like 8 or 9 op-eds written in response to that one opinion piece that I wrote. And I felt I even needed to apologize for it to begin my new job in earnest. So that was sort of a preview for me. Those years were a preview for me of what we saw right up to and in the wake of the George Floyd murder in 2020.
So it's interesting you talk about multiculturalism. Now, again, multiculturalism doesn't have the same sort of significance in the States it has in Canada. Multiculturalism really was a result of in the 60s when Canada was sort of redefining itself, and we had the B&B Commission talked about that we were a bilingual country, but a multicultural country. And what was interesting about that is in Canada, we talked about multiculturalism almost up until the second to last election. We always consider ourselves a multicultural society. Suddenly, we now talk about a diversity, but the diversity is often based upon a racial distinction. And I've often thought that actually, rather than creates the color of society and the complexity of society, it reduces it and flattens it, because while there may be people who are quote unquote white, there's still, we've lost the concept of Italians, Canadians, or Portuguese Canadians, right? Eastern European Canadians and so on, South American Canadians. And we no longer see people as in that complexity, but now we just, all those people who are Portuguese or Greek or Italian who have also had difficulties, establishing themselves in Canadian society, are now their struggles in being established or being ignored by reducing everything and flattening everything. Yeah. And I think one of the things that you're pointing out is that for the Jewish experience, by reducing everything to a diversity, it flattens our identity. Moreover, and I want you to talk now a little bit about the fact that it doesn't allow us to identify ourselves.
Yeah, so I almost wish the version of multiculturalism that you just described were still in place. But unfortunately, a much more dangerous, lethal form of multiculturalism. I wouldn't even call it multiculturalism anymore because it's not really multiple in any real way, has set in. There's, just to illustrate this point, there's a fierce debate going on in California over something called ethnic studies in K through 12. Now, ethnic studies has been building up in the universities in the U.S. and presumably in Canada. I know for a fact in Canada as well. These are not just studying about how other ethnicities live. I mean, that's interesting. I'm sign me up for that. It's about a power-based paradigm that certain groups of people have power and others don't, and based on that, based on where you are in this sort of pyramid of hierarchy, you either have privilege or oppression, greater levels of privilege and oppression. And that's what's meant nowadays in multicultural circles, and that's what they're teaching in ethnic studies. So, they put a bill in to create a new model curriculum, and the first versions of this bill are just, in California, are just pervasively anti-Semitic. I mean, they're explicitly anti-Israel. They're explicitly derogatory toward Jewish organizations, which they, regard as Zionist, in a pejorative sense, and the like. And okay, the Jewish community fights back against that, but in the end, much of the Jewish community accepts the underlying curriculum, which is built on this foundation, this ideological foundation of power and privilege and oppression. That is really at odds with the way most immigrant groups have understood America and probably understood Canada. We didn't see the United States as being a fundamentally racist place. We saw America as the land of opportunity that was imperfect, that didn't always live up to its high ideals. It was our job as good citizens, as good Jews, to fight for those ideals that we believed in. But that's not what this does, and it's confused a lot of Jews as well. They want to see this as the latest iteration of the civil rights movement. They want to see it as just a newer, slightly updated version of multiculturalism that you talked about before, whether you liked it or not. I mean, it was something I think most of us could kind of live with, even if parts of it seemed a little silly at times. We could live with it. This, in my view, we can't live with. And I think one of the problems is too many Jewish organizations, both in the U.S. and Canada, are willing to pay the price of admission because they want to be part of the new coalition. They want to be part of this new paradigm, and they're willing to say anything and do anything to be part of it, to be in the in-group on this, and not be perceived as part of sort of the right wing, whatever that is anymore. I mean, I'm a traditional liberal. Like I'm a center-left person. I spent my entire life on the center-left. I support reproductive rights. I support gay marriage. I support immigrant rights. I support criminal justice reform. And yet, in this discourse by those people, I'm regarded as a right-wing fanatic because I question that fundamental ideology that's set in. Now, I don't know if you want to go to questions. I was going to talk a little bit about where Jews fit in this, but maybe we could come back to it.
I do, but I just want to say, for those people who are just joining us on Zoom and joining us at Minden Gross, I'm here with David Bernstein, the author of Woke Anti-Semitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. David, one of the things, and I want to get into more of what you're talking about with respect to how it affects Jewish identity. One of the things I think it's important to point out, which I deeply appreciate in your book when I was reading it, is that in many ways, despite and notwithstanding everything that you've just said, you actually are sympathetic to many of what critical race theory or woke ideology, however you want to call it. I mean, you're sympathetic to some of the things it's trying to achieve. I think that's important to point out. Can you explain why is it you're actually sort of sympathetic to these things? And I think it comes out of the fact that you do come from the social justice background.
Yeah. So one thing I sort of left out in the beginning in my definition of woke ideology is that I do think that both of those tenets I talked about, the idea that bias and prejudice can be ingrained in the very structures of society, and that minorities might have insights that others don't, both of those can be true. Right? I mean, there's no question that Jim Crow America in the 1950s and 60s was a racist place, and to call it systemically racist would have been, I think, perfectly appropriate. Calling Nazi Germany systemically anti-Semitism, to look at it through that lens, would have been a perfectly legitimate way to look at it. And it's not to say that there's no systemic racism in Canada or the U.S. or anywhere else. It's just that it presumes that it's always true. That's the problem. That's where it gets dogmatic. And it tries to crowd out other possible explanations for why there may be group differences among people. It assumes that if there are, let's say, fewer than 13% black scientists, that means that there's rampant discrimination against black scientists, and there could be no other factors for why there are fewer than 13% black scientists. It's ridiculous, frankly. That's a ridiculous idea. But not only are you not allowed, not only is it not being entertained, you're called a racist if you say that there might be other factors at work. Similarly, this idea that people who have been victims of discrimination might have something to say. I mean, sure, of course. Like, I'm someone who grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in the 1970s and 80s. I got a lot of coins thrown at my feet in school. I got swastikas in my books. So I'd like to think as you'd want to hear what I have to say about anti-Semitism. But, look, there's other Jews around. You all are Jews, most of you, I would imagine, and that you might not experience anti-Semitism in precisely the same way. You may not agree on every insight I have about anti-Semitism in the U.S. and Canada. So, again, my lived experience can't be the final word. There's other forms of data besides lived experience. So in 2019, when the Pew Survey came out with a study that said American Jews are the most admired religious community, I have to be able to factor that in, and even in my own definition of anti-Semitism, and my own sense of pervasiveness of anti-Semitism, because my lived experience doesn't tell you everything you need to know. So again, I think that we can learn. It's not that there's nothing that this discourse has to say. Like yes, there are systemic problems. We should be aware of those systemic problems, or we should argue about those systemic problems and try to figure out what we agree with, what we disagree with. But it becomes dogmatic when it claims to explain everything, and it tries to push out every other point of view. That's the problem.
So, when I read this book, and I'm listening to you now, and I've listened to your podcasts on the Jewish instinct of liberal values that you can follow you on Twitter, I get the sense that part of what you're saying is that how this woke ideology harms Jews is that, and I get back to it, it's an illiberal ideology. And in fact, Jews do better underneath a classical liberal democratic society than they do in some sort of totalitarian society. And I could put it down to, the problems of liberalism, the problems of the emancipation that goes back to European emancipation in the 19th century, the 17th century that Moses Mendelssohn talked about, was in favor of that. The problem there was assimilation. But if it's a problem between assimilation and the czar, I choose the problems of assimilation. But it seems to be that in your book, and you're talking about that many Jewish organizations are now adopting this progressive ideology, right? And that as a result, it's becoming more problematic. And we, the Jewish community, are dividing upon the lines which are generally being dividing society. So one of the lines that it seems to be that people are aligning themselves along is whether you're for free speech or you're against free speech, right? Can you talk about how that factors into this ideology, and what's the best route that you should? Yeah,
so this really does. There is a free speech fault line that is really increasingly set in. Look, in the U.S., of course, we have the First Amendment, right, which is not an unqualified but close to unqualified right to free speech. There's no illegal hate speech in the United States as long as you're not trying to, kill somebody or advocate for others' immediate death. So there's a legal status, but there's also what you might call a culture of free speech that I think is central to society. That goes back to the idea of liberalism, that we need to be able to talk about things even when they're controversial. We don't want our conversations reported about some controversial thing that we said in a way that would prevent us from being able to talk. And what we're seeing in the current discourse is record amounts of self-censorship. There's surveys out about this, that there's more self-censorship today than there was during McCarthy's America in the 1950s. People don't want to upset other people. They don't want to say the wrong thing. They're walking on eggshells. You see this, by the way, in record numbers on college campuses, where college students say that they really won't share their authentic opinion because they're scared of what will be said about them and facing the consequences of that. Again, I think that's very profoundly unhealthy for society, a society that can't talk about complicated social issues in an open, thoughtful way is not a healthy society. And I feel like that's going to take us down a very dangerous road. And that's why people like Natan Sharansky, who wrote the foreword to my book, have deep insight, people who have lived in totalitarian countries, who know the difference between true totalitarianism like you face in the Soviet Union and the sort of imperfections of democratic life and the inequities sometimes in democratic life. He's able to see the difference. And he does argue that you have to have what he would call a town hall test. And that is, if you stand in the middle of the town and scream your head off about your opinion, will you face consequences or not? And he would say that we're failing that in the United States these days, that we can't really speak of our alternative viewpoints. Oftentimes, people engage in what he would call doublethink. That is, that we say one thing in public and we say something else in private. That's not healthy. And Jews especially do not do well. We tend to be the canary in the coal mine of any society which is becoming increasingly illiberal. That becomes a source of anti-Semitism. Illiberalism begets more illiberalism. Dogma begets more dogma. The more you start to cave into sort of dogmatic forces that become the loudest voices in the room, the more you give permission for others, even more extreme voices, to come in and to engage in their more extreme voices of dogma. You're seeing that in California. So people say, well, okay, we'll accept that version of ethnic studies that tells you exactly who has power and who doesn't, who's oppressed and who doesn't. We'll accept that, but we'll draw the line there. It's dogmatic, right? And before you know it, you've empowered a group of people, real radicals, who start to put something called critical Zionist studies. There's a new Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism that is having its first conference in the NYU area and at UC Santa Cruz. It's got the sponsorship of the University of California, Santa Cruz departments and so forth. And these are the most extreme ideologues. The same people who are pushing ethnic studies are now trying to get universities to establish these new centers for the critical study of Zionism. By the way, built on the Soviet model. You want to know where a lot of this comes from? It comes from the Soviet Union in the 1960s. Israel wins decisively the Six-Day War. The Soviet Union was worried about its client states in the Arab world, and they started a field called Zionology, which was a complete discrediting of Zionism, Zionist ideology. And that worked its way into our discourse. And when you combine it with sort of what you might call the postmodern ideologies that took hold in American universities, you realize that that's where we are today. There's been what they would call the long march through institutions, starting in radical universities like the California system, and working their way out of the university system into the larger society. That's what we're experiencing today, and it all started around 50 or so years ago, and ideological trends that most of us probably ignored.
So let me get more into how you feel that the critical race theory or wokeism is specifically anti-Semitic. And let me just read something very quickly from your book again. If I haven't talked about it, it's called Woke Anti-Semitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. And you talk about equity. That's always a big topic. And it says here, in May 2021, Anna Keating, who just quit her job in the chaplaincy services for Colorado College, wrote an essay for Hedgehog Review in which he described how the concept of equity played out at her former place of employment. The administrator decided that because Jews, being a tiny percentage of the U.S. population, are overrepresented in higher education generally, and at the college where I worked, and it's a quote from her, where she worked, in particular, anti-racism in this instance required that the number of Jewish students be reduced. Can you talk about equity in the Jews?
Thank you, yes. So this concept of equity, which was really popularized by Ibram X. Kendi in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, really has caught on in American institutions and public life and the like. And it basically holds that if your institution has less percentage than the approximate representation of various marginalized communities, then by definition it is engaging in racism or discrimination. So in other words, if your law firm does not have, and you're in a place like the United States where there are 13% African Americans, 13% blacks, by definition, you must be discriminating against them. There could be no other reason why there aren't that 13%. So what you have here is the sense that if there's only one explanation for why some groups do not, on average, do as well as others, then there can only be one explanation why some groups do better than others. In other words, they're part of the problem. They're doing the discriminating. They are, and this is the language you'll hear, complicit in white supremacy. So the American Jewish community, complicit in white supremacy. Asian Americans, white adjacent, right? That's what you're getting. By the way, why is it that Nigerian Americans are doing far better than the average, than white Americans on average? You know, so it can't really answer that, but in some sense, there's even a word for it, brown complicity. And I think that's a dangerous state of affairs. And the Jewish community is already experiencing the consequence of this. There was a bombshell of an article that was in Tablet magazine. I think it was by Jacob Siegel about the vanishing American Jew. I don't know if you've come across that. I'm happy to share it with you, Sam, and you could distribute it. But he was talking about the disappearance of American Jews in a lot of aspects of American life, like, you know, at a very rapid pace. So it's hard to really pin it on any other major factor besides this sort of the equity sweep that's taking place through many organizations and so forth. There are people losing their jobs who have performed admirably in whatever they were doing because the company decides that it needs to have a certain percentage of minorities, and they're willing to do it overnight. And I think this is dangerous, by the way, not just for Jews and other minorities that are associated with white supremacy. It's dangerous for society as a whole to go on. It breeds discontent and deep resentment of people who feel like that, you know, they didn't come from privileged backgrounds. I mean, I was just talking to Mr. Rosen here beforehand about some of the problems in American cities. Those problems are not limited to minority communities. There are people in former manufacturing towns that, you know, in opioid infested areas that are white, that have been really facing hard times for decades, by the way, this is not just a one generational phenomenon. And you're telling them, you elites are telling them that they're privileged, that they have privilege. You know what they'll give you the proverbial middle finger. And that's what's happening. It's causing deep-seated resentment, people losing jobs, people being told that they're privileged because they don't fit into the right racial categories. It's just not the right social model. It's not the way you advance race relations. It's not the way you lift people up. We should lift people up. I mean, I want us to invest more money in lifting up disadvantaged groups, not less. I want us to be more committed to that as societies, not less. But you can't do it by saying certain groups are now part of a permanent privileged class by virtue of their race, and others are part of a permanent underclass, or part of the oppressed class by virtue of their race. That's not the way you create the kind of social change that I think we'd all want.
So I'm glad you're talking about that, because I think many Jews like yourselves, and I'm sure people who are gathered by way of Zoom and are in this room, are also concerned with many of the views that you've expressed and concerned about improving the world. You know, there's an aspect of Judaism which talks about tikkun olam. I think sometimes some people emphasize that aspect a little bit too much over the particular aspects of our religion, our culture. But how do we then move forward and try and, you know, what is the framework for moving forward and to deal with these issues that you identified?
Yeah. So I've written about this. I write about it in the book. Tikkun olam doesn't need to mean that only there's one ideology in how you do social change. I mean, we can have different views of how to make the world a better place. You know, rabbis have been arguing for thousands of years about how to live a proper life. So we can argue about what is the best way to solve poverty. What is the best way to solve a housing shortage? I don't have to have all the answers. I have opinions. You have opinions. We can exchange our views. That can be part of what it means to be Jewish. That can be part of what you might call Jewish consciousness, is to argue about the best way to make the world a better place. But what's happened is Tikkun olam has been sort of hijacked by the radicals very often, not always, where they're saying tikkun olam means my view of anti-racism, my view of critical race theory is the only acceptable view. That's where it becomes dangerous. You know, I have politically conservative friends who I probably disagree on a lot of issues, but they have, you know, a heart of gold. You know, I have one I think about all the time who, you know, who does so much with disabilities. I mean, he and I have totally different views about how we should manage the economy and what our tax rate should be and everything else. But I know that he's trying to do tikkun olam in his own way. We have to have a big enough view of tikkun olam that we'd allow multiple perspectives on how to make the world a better place. That to me is very Jewish. The idea that there's only one way to do tikkun olam, that's not very Jewish at all.
You know, as you're talking, it makes me think that one of the problems that I see with progressive ideology, wokeism as you call it, is that we've lost the discussion around class. It used to be that politics is primarily one of division of wealth, right? And it's all about trying to optimize the tax system in order to distribute wealth. And we seem to have lost that class analysis. Yeah. And that also sort of, and as a result, we flattened the debate, and the growing tendency to identify people along identity politics is really impoverishing our political debate in society as a whole. And it's impoverishing our debates within the Jewish community. And that's where I'd like to go next. How do you see it impoverishing the debate within the Jewish community? I know you talked about it in the book.
Yeah, let me first hit this class point, and then we'll talk about in the Jewish community. So, you know, in the wake of the sort of the whole COVID controversy, there was a lot of talk about disparities in health outcomes and why our society needed to give, let's say, Black Americans the vaccine before anybody else got it because they've been systemically discriminated against. And it turns out when you really look at most of the literature around health outcomes, that if you control for income, that actually almost all the disparities that are produced are really the basis of economics and not race. In other words, if you're looking for disparate incomes, disparate differences in blacks and whites, you can find them. You'll say, okay, blacks are more likely to die of this or that. But once you control for income, you realize it's really about how much money you have, and if you're poor or not. Interestingly, there was this study that came out not too long ago about Black women dying at a rate of 3-to-1 over white women in childbirth. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. And then I remembered that I had seen another study, and I went back and found it online. The University of North Carolina Medical School found that if it gave Black women treatment for hypertension during pregnancy, it could reduce the disparity to about 0. And I thought, if your only explanation is that the reason why some groups do better than others is because of race and racism, you will not then look for other possible medical interventions that might actually erase that disparity. And that's what's happening. We're stuck in this one-size-fits-all, one explanation for why there might be differences, and anything else people might have to say they have to shut up about. And that's why I think it's very dangerous. For Jews, this might mean just shutting up about these problems. I mean, Jews tend to concern themselves with these larger social problems. But are we allowed to just say that maybe it's not just racism that's defining it? Are we allowed to say there might be other reasons why there are higher crime rates in certain areas than just race? Maybe fatherlessness in certain areas is a factor. Aren't we allowed to talk about that? And if we're not allowed to talk about it, are we going to really address social problems in the best way possible if we say that the only reason for it is modern day systemic racism? I think it corrupts the deliberative process in Jewish organizations. I mean, anybody who's ever been part of a Jewish organization, you remember times when they've stayed up the wee hours, particular lawyers, by the way, stay up to the wee hours of the night debating every fine letter of the public policy statement, right, about whether or not it's this or that. And that's great. That's wonderful. That's part of our tradition. But now we're told that there's only one answer here. And I've watched this happen in Jewish organizations I've been part of, where they say, okay, we have to accept this. The debate is over. The discussion is over. We can't debate why there are social problems in our countries. We have to now settle with this one-size-fits-all explanation. I think that really changes the character of Jewish life in ways that we haven't really fully grappled with.
I want to go back to, again, the theme of the wokeism and how it creates an anti-Semitism. And to kick off that question, perhaps again, I want to talk, I know a book that you're familiar with is Dora Horn's book, How Everyone Loves Dead Jews. And it's a collection of her essays and articles, and the article that I'm speaking of in particular talks about how she talks about the anti-Semitism of Purim and the anti-Semitism of Hanukkah. And really it's the anti-Semitism of Hanukkah which creates a problem for Jews. Can you talk about that? Make the connection, so I'm not.
Yeah, so I do think that's the right way of understanding it. Einat Wolf, the great Israeli, former Knesset member, Israeli thinker, likes to say that in many societies, and every society really, Jews have been asked to pay their pound of flesh. That is, that in order for us to respect your Jewish life, you have to do X to be part of our society. So for Jews in the U.S., let's say in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, we had to be shoehorned into this religious identity. In other words, we might have thought of ourselves, many of us, as an ethnic identity in a way, but we were told, well, you either have to be a Catholic, Protestant, or Jew. So becoming Jewish was a matter of faith, but it was also a survival tactic. It was paying our pound of flesh. And that's in some ways what the Hanukkah version of anti-Semitism is. It's this insistence that Jews conform with certain larger societal norms in order to maintain standing. And I think in wokeism, it's your pound of flesh is you must agree with us if you're going to be part of the community of the good, that America is a white supremacist state and that the white dominant class is oppressing everybody else, and that's why there are social problems. That is the pound of flesh that's being asked for Jews, and some Jews are willing to pay it. And I think that's what I'm pushing back against. I know some Jews can pay whatever they want. People can do whatever they want. But Jewish organizations that have prided themselves on their liberal values, on their openness, on machloket l'shem shamayim, arguments for the sake of heaven, I'm arguing to them, this is not who you are. Do not pay that pound of flesh. That pound of flesh is going to be just the starting point. It's going to demand that you become something different than you are. It's already corrupting our values as a people. We don't need to teach our children that as Jews, they're complicit in white supremacy, as, by the way, some Jewish day schools, including the ones that my sons went to, are doing. We don't need to do that. That is not who we are. It's not what we stand for. And so that's what I worry is happening. Look, is the Purim variety of anti-Semitism real? Are we worried that there are right-wing anti-Semites who will go into a synagogue and shoot people up? Absolutely. Jonathan Greenblatt, who is the CEO of the ADL, likes to compare anti-Semitism on the right to a hurricane and anti-Semitism on the left to climate change. So on the right, it's fast-moving, it's violent, it's immediate, right? It's dangerous. On the left, it's like climate change. It's corrosive. It's slow. You can't always see it so clearly. And I think he's right about that. But what he leaves out, and what I'm really trying to do here in connecting the dots, is that it's easy to talk about the ideological underpinnings of anti-Semitism on the right. We know that if there are populist views that immigrants are replacing ordinary Americans. That's called the Great Replacement Theory. And the Jews are doing all the replacing from behind the scenes. That's anti-Semitism. We can talk about that. We can even talk about it in the Muslim world with the Islamist ideology that has taken hold in parts of the Muslim world. I mean, it's no accident that there was a 9/11 or that there were terrorist attacks. That's an ideological trend. But when we talk about anti-Semitism on the left, we tend to talk about it as a set of symptoms without any causes. We don't talk, and Jonathan Greenblatt doesn't talk about the ideological CO2 emissions that are producing the climate change on the left. And I think it's absolutely imperative that we locate the ideological causes, because we are not just fighting symptoms. We are fighting ultimately much larger dogmas and ideologies. That's really the point of my book, is that you can't sever your understanding from anti-Semitism from the larger ideological trends taking place in society. You won't win. If every kid believes that America or Canada is an oppressive state, that will not be good for the Jews. They will see us as being part of the oppressors because we've done well on average. When you conflate success with oppression, that is not going to fare well for the Jews.
And you talk about that. You talk about that book in your book on the sort of topic of merit in the Jews and how people's ethnics, whether it's ethnic minorities such as, again, the Italian community, Portuguese, Greek communities, Jewish community, have gained success. They fought hard for it with hard work, and this desire to sort of attribute success to oppression denies those histories, and again conflates and flattens the identities of those different groups. I want to ask you now, with your work with the Jewish Institute of Liberal Values, how do you see working towards trying to regain some ground or fighting against this this progressivism, this wokeism? And how I want you to talk about that is to give you sort of an example of things that are happening in Canada. And a little while ago in the city of Ottawa, there was problems with anti-Semitism. And the solution that the school board came up with was to appoint an equity coach. There's already some sort of equity coach dealing with all kinds of hate, all kinds of racism. And so they thought the best approach was to sort of adopt that same sort of ideological terminology, the terminology of progressivism, and try and use it as a way of fighting the anti-Semitism. Do you think that's going to be ultimately successful? And if not, then what's your suggestions?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do not believe those efforts are going to be successful. That is the primary approach from many Jewish organizations as well, saying, well, if you're going to adopt diversity and equity inclusion, we want in, right? We want to be protected by that. We want to be viewed as one of the oppressed groups. So we enter into the oppression Olympics. But we never do well in the oppression Olympics. We just don't. Your average success as a community is not going to put you in good standing. So I think we're begging for something. We're paying the pound of flesh to be part of the DEI intersectional table, and yet we're not really getting any standing. We know we're not getting any standing, but we got to try harder and harder. Agree with them on everything. Become more and more progressive so that you get the credibility on the intersectional table that you crave for. I don't think that's going to work, and I think it's wrong. I don't want to live in a society that functions that way either, right? It's in a liberal society. So what do I think we should do? Number one, I think we have to have center-left to center-right coalitions that are much more robust, that are willing to stand up to radical ideology, whether it comes from the far right or the far left. In other words, most people in Canada and the U.S. are reasonable human beings. They don't wake up in the morning trying to define who's oppressed and oppressors. They don't wake up in the morning thinking that immigrants have taken their jobs. They're normal people who are just trying to make a living, who have probably moderate political views, yet they're being drowned out by the radicals. So I think we really need to get moderates to fight back. And we need to work with, in the U.S. front, it's multiple ethnic groups that, like Indians and Chinese Americans and others, who came to this country because they were trying to escape totalitarian ideologies in their home countries, and are looking for their kids to avail themselves of the American dream or the Canadian dream. We need to help them find their voice and not allow the politics of the identity politics on the far left and the right to prevent that narrative for helping their kids succeed in American society and in Canadian society. So I think that that's one of the most important things we can do. You can't fight anti-Semitism just by fighting the symptoms. You have to try to recapture the center, which means people who are able to talk to each other and have conversations. You've got to restore liberalism itself. That's number one. Part of that means you got to get people to be courageous again, to stand up for what they believe in, and not to cave anytime somebody insinuates that they might be a racist if they don't think like them. I think that just too many of us did that. Me sometimes too, by the way. There's this great phrase that I love: never wrestle with a pig because you'll get dirty and the pig likes it. And I think a lot of us feared getting dirty. Why? We don't want that. I don't need that. I'll go home and have a nice dinner with my family. I don't want to get dirty in that conversation. But because we didn't get dirty, we abandoned the field to the pigs. And the pigs define reality for us, and all of a sudden, the majority of people who have moderate, thoughtful views on the world have become silenced. And there's this concept called spirals of silence that sets in. It's even if a small group of people with vehement views can silence a lot more people with more moderate views. And I think we've got to create spirals of courage to fight back, and we've got to figure out how to get people to stand up for their rights, to stand up, at the school board meeting. Doesn't mean you have to be a jerk. Doesn't mean you have to shut down the school board meeting or scream at people, but you still can stand up for your kids, your values. I think we've lost that ability. We've folded too often, and we've got to get moderate, thoughtful people willing to stand up for their values, for their rights, and the like. And this is a long-term effort. I mean, it's sort of a generational battle, and I'm trying to steel us for that generational battle rather than think we just got to yell every time someone commits an anti-Semitic act. We've got to yell every time somebody commits an anti-Semitic act. Most of the time, let's say, people commit anti-Semitic acts. But that's not going to do it in because we're playing this endless game of whack-a-mole where all we're doing is complaining about, the inevitable outcomes of a crazy ideology that is set into our institutions. If everybody thinks the world is oppressed and oppressors, if that's what they're teaching kids in college, you think that Israel is going to be viewed as the good guys on campus? How? If you're not willing to fight the larger ideological fight, then everything else is inevitable. Everything else is inevitable. It is just a matter of time when that ideology sets in and defines exactly the way that people view the Arab-Israel conflict. We're seeing it in the data. I mean, there's 20-some years of Gallup poll data on perceptions of people around Israel, and for the first time ever in 2023, the majority of Democrats polled were more sympathetic toward the Palestinians than Israel. It used to be 2-1 in Israel's favor, 2-1 in Democrats. It was 65-18 in 2013 in the society at large. That ain't the case anymore, I have to tell you. And more people are buying into the harder narrative that Israel is a settler colonialist state. And you're seeing that catch on in progressive circles. Still a minority of Democrats, by the way, but it tells you can see the dangers there. You can see the dangers, and it requires, I think, Jewish voices to really stand up for their own interests in this environment.
I saw a little while ago, and we're going to go to questions just momentarily. I remember about 2 years ago, I attended a Zoom webinar with a famous Jewish politician, former Minister of Justice for another Jewish organization, and they have brought in groups from speakers from oppressed groups, and those oppressed groups, they were talking about allyship, and they were all very much against anti-Semitism, but I know that those different groups had participated in anti-Semitic actions with respect to Israel, right? They were all very good about making sure that, as you talked about earlier, about the ethno-nationalist hatred towards Jews, but they were very silent on the fact that they were equating Israel with an apartheid state. Yeah, sure. And I sometimes, and maybe I'll ask you to answer this, is I sometimes think that the more we focus, the big thing now is Holocaust education, but I think the more we focus on Holocaust education, we cause two problems from ourselves. First of all, we don't talk about what is the lesson that we're supposed to learn from the Holocaust. And certainly I don't see Jewish identity as entirely being about the Holocaust. I don't think the lesson is that we're victims. I think, as a matter of fact, we're survivors. We've built a country, Israel, and we've continued on. And it's important to learn how we've done that, mostly by continuing our education. But the second thing is with the suppression analysis, it buys into this argument that we were once the victims and now we are the oppressors. And they see the new Holocaust being transformed and transposed to the Israel or the Palestinian-Israel conflict. Can you just briefly comment that, and then we're going to go to questions? Sure.
So if I've been following the conflict, my entire career really, between Israel and Palestinians and Gaza and so forth. In 2008, I think there was the first round of conflict between Israel and Hamas and Gaza. And I followed every substantive conflict, and they all followed a similar trajectory, right? At least in the U.S., Israel initially has some leeway to act against whatever the rocket fire coming from Gaza, the tunnels, whatever, kites. And within a few days, the mainstream press starts to say, wait a second, there's disproportionate force being used. More Palestinians are dying than Israelis, so much media in Israel is engaged in an immoral enterprise. And then the pressure mounts and Israel has to stop. That's the trajectory. Not May 2021. May 2021, from the get-go, Israel was the bad guy. There was no leeway there. And so you could really feel how this ideology had sort of taken hold and shifted the discourse around Israel. And it does have implications for Jews in so many ways. The narrative has flipped. It's even hard sometimes to make the case for other forms of anti-Semitism. I have a friend named Nicole Levitt. She is an attorney for women who have experienced domestic abuse, and she works for a nonprofit organization in Philadelphia. After the George Floyd reckoning, during the George Floyd reckoning, they brought in diversity, equity, inclusion consultants into the organization so that it would embrace DEI practices. And during that discussion, Nicole raised the issue of anti-Semitism and was told that she was decentering anti-Blackness. That is a comment that you might hear, decentering anti-Blackness. In other words, she was removing the spotlight from anti-Semitism and from anti-Black racism to anti-Semitism, which was a form of white supremacy in and of itself. During that same time, they decided to divide the staff into affinity groups: white affinity group, Asian affinity group, Black affinity group, brown affinity group. And she said, well, I don't really want to be in a white affinity group. I don't really consider myself white. I consider myself Jewish. And she was told that she had to be part of the white affinity group. And she was asked to sign a contract that I own that all white people are racist and I'm no exception. It sounds outrageous, but I have to tell you, that's not unusual. And so you can imagine how that affects the Jewish community. And the fact that we're not seeing more anti-Semitism in that tells you is a very worrisome sign.
So let's go to questions for a moment, and let's go first to the room. If anyone has a question, then perhaps we can go to the internet. So is there anyone in the room that would like to ask a question? I see Stephen Posen has a question. Let's go put my glasses on. It is Stephen, okay. Ask your question, then I'll restate it so everyone will hear it. We should be telling you that food should be.
I think the Jews are the best source of fighting this notion. Number two is, do you think there's any role for the law in fighting anti-Semitism? Not much. I'd like to know. I don't know enough about what the law is in the United States or in Canada on anti-Semitism.
So the first question Stephen asking is, there's a lot of Jewish organizations doing this. How can we Jewish organizations fight the anti-Semitism? And the second question is how can the law fight that? I might be able to answer the second question for you.
Yeah, so obviously there's a broader argument here. It's not just about the Jewish community. What I want the Jewish community to do is see the dangers and to connect the dots between the growth of this ideology and the growth of anti-Semitism on the left. And I want us to become part of a new liberal coalition that tries to restore liberal values in American society. I think that's the most important thing we can do to fight this variant of anti-Semitism, the Hanukkah variety, as Sam said. So yes, there's more than that. It's not just about Jews. It's joining forces with Black Americans who don't want their kids to be taught that the system is rigged against them, or Latinos who came to this country in search of greener pastures, or Asian Americans who don't want the country they fled to sound like the country they fled from. So those are our new allies. There's a lot of them out there. We can find them, but we've got to want to, and we've got to be willing to create some tension between the traditional progressive left-wing coalition and the Jewish community. And let me say something about the law. Look, clearly the U.S. has a different legal structure on this, has anti-discrimination law, and it's very likely that some of what's done in the way I described it at that Philadelphia workplace in the domestic abuse nonprofit does not fly legally. It violates the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So some of what can happen here to shift the environment would be legal challenges to some of these more extreme diversity, equity, inclusion practices that raise the risk for a company or a workplace to do something completely outrageous, like separate everybody into affinity groups. That is probably illegal by, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And there are legal cases that are sort of working their way through the courts now that I believe will probably win. Not every case, but many of them. I mean, even the recent affirmative action case probably shifted the legal parameters around some of these cases in the U.S.
Yeah, the U.S. system is much different, Stephen, than our system in Canada. Listen, I'm going to give you a very unadulterated and somewhat pessimistic view of it. I've been watching things develop in Canada for a number of years. Many of you know I was a bencher for 4 years, so I've seen up close at the Law Society what's happening and how what's happening in the Law Society is a sort of indicative of what's happening on a larger scale. Our institutions like the Law Society have been captured. Now that Jordan Peterson has been regulated, I'm sure they'll bring regulations against me for saying something like that. But there's been a concatenation of cases which have made it very difficult to fight the traditional anti-Semitism that we used to fight. We're no longer talking about equality now, and the concept of equity has become more and more built in by and accepted by our Supreme Court. The Fraser decision and the Ontario human rights cases, human rights tribunal cases that are basically, not only that affirmative action is okay, but now they don't call it affirmative action anymore. They call it accelerating careers, right? We see advertisements all the time saying that you should be hiring these types of people. It's no longer open hiring anymore, particularly in the schools, the universities. That would all be justified in Canadian law now. You have a horrible case called Handeman and Neufeld, which now brings equality rights in line as a way of limiting free speech and limited a defamation case. So there's this concatenation, which I think that of cases, which makes it very difficult now for Jews to fight many of the anti-Semitism, some of the anti-Semitism, which is primarily on the left, equating Israel with an apartheid state. Stuff we've seen at McGill University, things that has happened at U of T and other campuses. That's not to say that we shouldn't fight. If you want to afterwards, there are many different initiatives that B'nai Brith is involved in. One of the initiatives is I think, with respect to the Handeman case and how it affects the anti-SLAPP legislation in Ontario, is that if the courts are now telling us that oppression analysis is going to be involved in the assessment of a defamation case and the effectiveness of an anti-SLAPP motion, then we should ask our provincial government to amend the anti-SLAPP legislation. So I actually don't think it's, despite the fact I'm a lawyer, despite the fact I'm the national director of this legal association, I don't know if the courts are going to help us anymore. I think we have to re-engage in society, and this is what I think another thing that David's saying. We have to re-engage in society and to re-engage in trying to promote liberal values of equality. And I see that as important in trying to get the government to change some of its legislation, lobby it on the legislation with respect to anti-SLAPP. And personally, it's my personal opinion that I want to make that clear. In case Michael Mawson is listening, it's not the B'nai Brith policy, but I'm very concerned about the Peterson case and about the regulation of professionals, right? Because how could a lawyer start defending his or her client in the best way, in the most strenuous way that it can, which is what our barrister doc says. If we're going to become in favor of diversity, inclusion, and equity, as I say, DIE, then we've got problems ourselves. I'm a criminal lawyer. I defend many people charged with sexual assault. How am I supposed to defend people now? So I'm very concerned about it. Let me go to a question on from the outside. Sorry, Sandra Grafton. I know you're a senator, but I said we're going to go to one. You'll get the next one, okay, sir? I'm reading from Deborah Baumgarten. She has a bit of a long question. She says, I'm interested in your views on the way in which synagogues are experiencing the changes you describe. I know they are not the only Jewish spaces. Any thoughts on that? How things are being discussed between Orthodox and non-Orthodox shuls? Do you find that there is openness to your views among non-Orthodox shul leaders? So, and then she goes on to ask about whether it's in the U.S. or in Canada. And then we're going to have two more questions from inside the room from Senator Grafstein and my good friend, also a criminal lawyer, Matthew Freeberg.
Sounds great. Thank you. So I do think synagogue life is affected. Obviously, Reform, conservative, Reconstructionist congregations are drastically affected. The Reform denomination has done trainings for rabbis and cantors that instruct people to disrupt their daily acts of whiteness. Now, where does this come from? It comes from this framework called white supremacy culture, the idea that our Western societies are fundamentally and hopelessly controlled by a white supremacy culture, a dominant culture that values white values, whatever those are, over black values or brown values or whatever, Asian values. So in other words, the idea of being on time to work or school, that is a white supremacy value. And I know you think this sounds ridiculous, and does anybody take that seriously? Unfortunately, I would laugh at it, but unfortunately, people do take it seriously. My son's school system, Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland, where 110,000 Jews live, is teaching that to the kids, this white supremacy values framework. And unfortunately, rabbis and cantors are being instructed in this, and many synagogues have just become sort of bastions of radical social justice ideology. Not all. You know, the first synagogue I think I spoke to, maybe the second, was in Vancouver, and so I've actually found that the Canadian Jewish community tends to be more open to questioning this than the American Jewish community. My sense from talking to you, and I've had a lot of conversations with you all, maybe you'll have a different perspective, is that this ideology actually is spreading more quickly and rapidly in Canada than the U.S. because there's no real counterbalance to it. But at the same time, Canadian Jews tend to be a little bit more traditional and are less sort of psychologically aligned with the left than American Jews are, who have a long history in the civil rights movement. So I think this is huge in synagogue life. I just went to speak to what you might have considered a more politically diverse major synagogue in California. I'm not going to say the one. And I got this is in the last few weeks, and I got some odd emails from my sponsors who said, you know, maybe you should pare down your remarks to 20 minutes so we have more time to Q&A. And it happened like 3 times. And by the time I got there, I realized that there was this cancellation campaign underway in which the rabbi decided no longer to facilitate the conversation as he planned, and that they were thinking about even canceling it last minute. Because, you know, somehow I must be articulating some unacceptable point of view that was going to corrupt their conversation in the synagogue. There were individual people who were pushing back against that. So that is deeply ingrained in certain synagogues. It's not everybody. It's not even a majority. It's a small group of people that have more sort of cultural power in their institutions, in Jewish institutions, who are playing gatekeeper for everybody else. The first talk I gave to a synagogue right after my book came out in, I think it was early November 2022, went off without a hitch. I was like, and it was, you know, I was nervous. What's this going to be like? You know, I'm speaking to a bunch of liberal Jews who I probably agree on a lot of things, but might not like what I'm saying about this. The rabbis called me 3 days afterwards and said, you know, apparently you have detractors. And I said, well, tell me something I don't know. He said, well, I was on a call with the board of rabbis, and I was asked, I asked to bring up this. We're talking about anti-Semitism in the community, what to do about it. And I said we should have the conversation about David Bernstein's book, and he was immediately shut down by other rabbis and told it was beyond the pale and that this was part of the problem. So you can see how this works. Now, maybe 9 out of 10 rabbis or 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 would have been perfectly okay with it. But those loud voices that shut it down, the gatekeepers, made it impossible for everybody else to discuss it. So what my group, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, did is that we had a statement that we circulated among rabbis that was written by rabbis for rabbis, upholding these liberal values and warning of the dangers of this ideology. And it was signed by 250 Reform and conservative rabbis. And so, and many of those rabbis, by the way, were called racist and transphobe by their fellow rabbis on listservs. I mean, they paid the price for signing that statement. So we've got to push back in our own institutions. And this goes back, we have to fight in our own backyard first, in a way, to make sure that our own institutions live up to their values.
Senator Grafstein, you had a question. Again, say your question and I'll repeat it. Comment and a question.
I don't know what the Jewish community is anymore. I really don't know when you say we Jews anymore. Language is very, very important. And I believe, in the comment, unless you can unify the Jewish community, so-called, it's very difficult to try to convince others who are not Jewish of the Jewish issues that are important to Jews. I think in the United States, or in Canada, he put his finger on this, we don't have a Jewish community in the definitional sense, in the sense of the imperils, the Sussems language. Language is really, really important.
Let me just, so,
And so that's my first
yeah, so let me say it to everyone because they may not have heard out there, and it's an important comment. So, Sharon Grafstein, if I got you right, you pointed out to David that you don't know what language is important. We need to define our terms. It's important to understand what we mean when we say the word Jewish community, and more importantly, that you can't unify. You have to unify the Jewish community in order for the outside Jewish community to sort of understand what the issues are that affect us. That's your general comment. Now, what's your question, sir?
First of all, is there a correlation between Jews and the rising tide of anti-Semitism, Jews being a trigger to the rising tide of anti-Semitism washing over Canada? Certainly, United States. In Canada, the largest Jews represent less than 2% of the population, and we now represent 8% of the hate issues in Canada that are correlated. It's probably more than that. So Jews, anti-Semitism is by far the most gigantic issue. It's the greatest in my lifetime. I've never seen it from everywhere and every side, including the Law Society, Doctor Societies, my law school, University of Toronto, York University certainly. It is an epidemic, and it's getting worse. First question is, how do we stem the tide of anti-Jewish Jews who are anti-Semites in the classical sense?
So your first question
coming from the left.
Yeah. So his first question is recognizing that anti-Semitism has become an epidemic, given the fact that we're less than 2% of the Jewish population, but the hate crimes involve us so much. That how can we stem that anti-Semitism, particularly from the left, not so much from the right? Yeah,
right.
How we do it.
So as for language and how we define ourselves as Jews, look, we all agree that Jewish community is not united. I don't know that it's ever been, by the way, united. I mean, we've never been one thing, one community. There's diversity in our community. When I'm speaking of the Jewish community, I'm speaking of mainstream Jewish organizations. I'm trying to influence the way that they think about these issues, so I think that they'll fight back more effectively against these trends. So that's what I'm speaking about. I do believe there is a Jewish community, even if it's not unified. You know, I can't tell you the area. I'm staying with a family friend. I can't tell you the precise area I'm staying, but we were walking around, and he said, it's about 50-50 Jews here. He goes, this is the Jewish Starbucks in my area. And he says, almost everybody at this Starbucks is Jews, and the one down the street, almost no Jews. And I was laughing, and I looked in the window, and it looked like a lot of Jews having coffee. So, and again, and not to say that there's a unified community, but there is something about being Jewish that I think we can talk about, or else then the word Jewish itself would have no meaning if there wasn't. So what do we do about this? Look, I'm making an argument that we've got to fight back against larger ideological trends, that the anti-Semitism we're experiencing is happening because our societies are sort of being pulled apart at the seams by larger forces, and that those larger forces are making people feel very insecure about their lives, about their place in society, and they're latching onto simplistic explanations, which you might call conspiracy theories, dogmas, that try to explain away the world in very simple terms that oftentimes lead to anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism itself is the ultimate conspiracy theory. That's really what it is. It's a conspiracy theory. It's different from other forms of racism or prejudice, in that it's not the idea that you know, it's not hatred necessarily. It's the idea that Jews possess too much power, and that they're controlling everything from behind the scenes. That's the primary character of anti-Semitism, and it's very susceptible to being exploited at times of profound insecurity in society. So in some sense, we've got to regain our ground politically. I know this sounds like a depressing way of fighting anti-Semitism because it's so big, but I think that's ultimately the project. And so I think we ultimately have to stand up for these larger democratic liberal values and get others to do so as well.
Yes, Sandra, because you're here, and David will certainly.
I'll just do it quickly, and I'll.
Okay. Okay. Sandra, you're a politician. I don't know if it's going to be that short.
The correlation between secularism and anti-Semitism in the Jewish community.
So he's
okay, secularism, probably. I mean, I don't think so. I think Jews, no matter how secular they were victims of anti-Semitism. No matter how religious they are, they're victims of anti-Semitism. There may be certain kinds of anti-Semitism that are directed explicitly at Orthodox Jews. I mean, you're seeing that in New York City right now, by the way. I mean, I could probably walk down certain neighborhoods of Brooklyn because I'm not wearing a kippah or a black hat and not face anti-Semitism, whereas if you're a black hat Jew, you might be a target. So, yes, there can be a correlation, but there's not always a correlation, and I don't think you need religion for there to be anti-Semitism. One last thing before, and I know we're running out of time. This idea of what do you do about left-wing Jews who are self-hating or anti-Semites themselves? Look, not a lot, other than to show that they're the minority. You know, there was a letter being circulated by a bunch of far left-wing anti-Zionist Jewish academics. They signed, 90 of them signed a letter to Governor Newsom asking him to support this radical version of ethnic studies that's anti-Zionist. And so what my organization did is we circulated another Jewish academics letter that, 3 days in already has 270 signatories that we sent to the governor as well to say, that's a minority voice. We're the dominant voice. Don't be fooled by that. That may be the best we can do.
So I have two more questions. One is from, first of all, Jill Mayer, who helps the B'nai Brith. Jill Mayer, who helps us with B'nai Brith, has pointed out to me to say that if you are an Ontario lawyer, please note this program qualifies for 1 hour of EDI content, or as I like to say, DIE content. So Michael Freeman asks, when synagogue, Matthew Freeberg, we're going to ask you a question to keep it short, and then Michael Freeman has a question from the internet.
So,
yeah.
I worry for my kids, not really for myself. I have young kids, and I worry that.
I'll repeat this.
Can you repeat it?
And what I see in the last 10 or 20 years is a slow unraveling of the social fabric in Canada and the United States. And fundamentally, the way I see it is you can't sustain a culture, a country, a society that hates itself and that teaches its children that they're colonialist, misogynist, homophobic, anti-Semite, whatever. Where I know you don't have a crystal ball, and I know you can't tell the future, but based on the totality of the evidence information that you know in your career, what's your prognosis for where this is going? Is there a way back? Because when you say, well, what we need to do is just get in line and dialogue with more centrist groups, I don't know many centrist groups that want to, interact with the Jewish community. And I'm not sure this problem is so deep and so wide, and the chasm is so deep that I don't know if Jews can solve this problem.
We can't alone, obviously, but we can play a role. Look, so Michael, right? Matthew's concerned for his kids, really, about where things are going, the trajectory of our societies that are the unraveling of the social fabric, and is wondering, is there a positive prognosis here? I mean, couldn't there be? Are we sort of watching something inevitable and inexorable happen where our societies continue to go down this trajectory? Look, I actually am more optimistic than that. I'm more hopeful than that. I do believe our societies can find their footing. You said that societies that hate themselves tend not to stand up for their own values. I think that's absolutely true, by the way. And I think that's why this really depends on moderate voices expressing themselves in moderate ways and regaining a sense of what it means to be a Canadian or an American. I like to call this sort of patriotic pluralism. We need to both be pluralistic in our understanding of our societies and patriotic in standing up for these values. Yes, these societies are imperfect, but our original narrative, this idea that America and Canada are imperfect societies trying to live up to their own high ideals, to me is a much more sustainable narrative than the idea that we're pervasively racist, corrupt, white supremacist societies. I think they're untrue, and it's the wrong way of getting us from here to there. When you want to fix a corporation, a great consultant would tell you, first have them take stock of their strengths before their weaknesses. It's called appreciative inquiry. Start with what you're really good at, and then you can build on that and make your culture and your organization a better organization. I think we need a little appreciative inquiry in the United States and Canada. I do think, look, these societies are remarkably resilient. This is not the first or the worst we've ever had it. And we've gone from really bad places to really much better places. I mean, imagine what it felt like after the Civil War in the United States and the doomsaying that must have been coming out of people's mouths about where our societies were going. I mean, we almost destroyed ourselves in that process, and yet, we moved on to greater things. So I do think that can. I don't know exactly how it will happen. What I do believe strongly, though, is that thoughtful people who believe in these core values have to organize. Now, and that includes Jews. And, Jews played a tremendous role, an indispensable role in the civil rights movement in the United States. Why can't we play a similarly indispensable role in restoring liberal values into our societies and strengthening them?
Let me get to Michael Freeman. Thank you, Michael. Let me get to Michael Freeman. Thank you, Michael, for being so patient. He asks, when synagogues such as Holy Blossom, which is a Reform synagogue, a very large Reform synagogue in Toronto, co-sponsor events with regressive anti-Israel origins like NIF, New Israel Fund, they are clearly supporting those that delegitimize Zionism and are concluding with those who want to eliminate Israel. And it's not so much a question, I suppose, it's a statement. And certainly, Michael, I think we would all agree with you on that point. Nope.
I might push back a little bit.
Okay, push back. Feel free.
Look, I mean, I'm a Zionist through and through. I probably agree with you on what Israel is, what it should be, and the like. I think, though, if we are people who stand up for liberal values in the larger society, we have to stand up for liberal values within the Jewish community, and that means allowing for differences of opinion around Israel. And if we stifle that entirely, then we don't have very much credibility in fighting the kind of illiberalism that is producing anti-Semitism. So that doesn't mean that your synagogue should have a speaker from New Israel Fund. I probably disagree with that speaker as much as anybody, but I would say that I want there to be cultures of openness. I want there to be hard, difficult conversations around Israel in a synagogue. I think that's perfectly appropriate. Where your particular synagogue or a synagogue draws the line is, certainly in my view would be absurd to have a synagogue bring in an anti-Zionist speaker. And I don't think the New Israel Fund qualifies that as such. You might disagree with that, but I don't think that they do. I think that they're critical of Israeli policy, again, in a way that doesn't comport with me and my views, but that doesn't mean I think that they should be drummed out of the conversation in the same way as maybe the Jewish Voices for Peace, which is an anti-Israel, anti-Zionist group.
So listen, I know, Stephen, you have a question. Maybe you could just hang back a little bit and ask, because 30-second comment.
As a member of Holy Blossom Temple, I have a huge issue with the fact that their Israel group, pro-Israel group, wants to be a platform to permit all voices to be heard. I think that's BS. You have to have a point of view and pursue the point of view. To say I've opened up all views, that means I stand for absolutely nothing. That's my view.
No, but you have to listen to other views. That's the point. In order to validate your own.
Well, I think Stephen was just expressing a bit of a concern that the Israel body or committee at the Holy Blossom is really an ideologically attuned body to one particular wavelength. And I think what you're expressing, Stephen, and I know John Rosen in the here is sort of disagreeing with that. I'm not a member of the Holy Blossom, but I do know that many organizations, again, maybe it's the committee that you're with, the Holy Blossom, Law Society, that are civil society organizations have been captured by woke people. And I think it's incumbent upon, and what David is talking about, it's incumbent upon those people like yourself, everyone in the internet and here who believe in a moderate voice have to re-engage in society. On that note, I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Jill Mayer for organizing it. I want to thank Elite, who works at B'nai Brith, for coming. I want to thank Stephen Posen and my good friend from Ottawa, Ian Cantor. It's good to see you again, Ian. Thank Minden Gross for hosting this event. If I've forgotten anyone, I apologize. Thank you again. We look forward to see you on our next event. When is the lead? Do we have a date? November? End of October? Sometime this fall, it'll be one with CPD hours also attributed to it. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks for